All right, so welcome to Lecture 6 on Chapter 6, Structuring the Global Economy. So, the introduction to this chapter explains some differences between before Bretton Woods and after Bretton Woods, or the era that we're living in today. It asserts that a global capitalist system emerged in about 1896. Of course, there was earlier capitalism, but it's sort of a global capitalist system as such around that time, and reached something of a peak throughout the world in 1914. Since then, it talked about how transportation has shifted from railroads and steamships to airplanes. The telegraph gave way to the internet for communication. You had large scale immigration then, but also today. It explained the law of comparative advantage, where nations started to really specialize in different ways, where a nation would concentrate on producing the goods and services that it does best in comparison to other things that it does. You have free trade and the elimination of trade barriers then and today. And it points out that today and back then, the global economy was not equally good for everyone and was bad for many. So, economic development during and after World War II. A term that was introduced is autarky, which is a turn inward of a nation in order to create as much economic self-sufficiency as possible. This basically went hand in hand sort of with isolationism, which is a term used in foreign policy when a nation doesn't really get involved in the conflicts of other nations abroad. You have, and we'll talk about the Bretton Woods system in more detail, but the Bretton Woods system emerges after a 3-week meeting in July in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. So now on to what is the Bretton Woods system. So the backdrop for the system was that there was a lack of economic cooperation globally. You had high tariffs and import restrictions and other protectionist practices. So how a tariff works, it's kind of confusing because the way so there's a trade war happening at the time of this presentation being recorded between the United States and China. And how that works is that both the United States and China are putting high tariffs on imports from each other. So the Trump administration has put tariffs on Chinese products that are being imported into the United States. And the way Trump talks about tariffs, it sounds as if China pays the tariffs to the U.S. government. But that's not how it works. How it works is that American buyers of Chinese products pay a tax or a tariff to the U.S. government. And how that's supposed to hurt China is that it discourages people in the United States from using Chinese goods because they're more expensive because of these tariffs or taxes. So that's going to hurt China. So that's how it works. It's not that China pays the tariffs to the U.S. and the U.S. pays the Chinese tariffs to China. It's that Chinese buyers pay the tariffs on U.S. goods to China, and U.S. buyers pay the U.S. tariffs to the U.S. government on Chinese goods. So that's how that works. So that there were a lot of tariffs as the backdrop where being used to discourage interacting economically with other nations. So the Bretton Woods system consists of 5 key elements, where each participating state would establish a par value for its currency expressed in terms of gold, or equivalently in terms of the gold value of the US dollar to determine exchange rates. A lot of the Bretton Woods system is about stabilizing exchange rates. The official monetary authority in each country, usually a central bank, would agree to exchange its own currency for those of other countries at the established rates, plus or minus a 1% margin, making possible trade at or near the exchange rate. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, was created as a forerunner to the World Bank, which we'll talk about in a minute, to establish, stabilize, and oversee exchange rates. They were empowered to approve the par values of currency. So it was like an international organization making sure all nations were playing fairly in terms of determining exchange rates, that therefore stabilizing exchange rates. Member states agreed to eliminate all restrictions on the use of its currency for international trade. And the entire system was based on the US dollar. So what emerged was a system in which the U.S. could not change the value of its dollar while other countries could, but as infrequently as possible, making exchange rates stable. So the Bretton Woods system is really based on the supremacy of the U.S. as a superpower, which was absolutely the case coming out of World War II. What also went along with the Bretton Woods system seemed to be expansions of social welfare programs in many countries to deal with the recession, layoffs, reduction in wages, and bankruptcies and uncompetitive firms. So there were social welfare programs introduced, and usually very high taxes, especially on the wealthy, to pay for these programs to sort of provide a safety net, as a lot of economies were damaged after World War II. So the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, was a system for the liberalization of trade that grew out of Bretton Woods and came into existence in 1947. It operated into 1995 when it was superseded by the World Trade Organization, which we've mentioned before, the WTO. The GATT was simply a forum for the meeting of representatives of countries, while the WTO, or World Trade Organization, is an independent organization. The WTO negotiations have dealt with such issues as reducing tariffs on the trading of goods, dealing with non-tariff barriers, and liberalizing international trade in agriculture. Trade-related intellectual property rights. So these were negotiated through the World Trade Organization to protect the interests of those individuals, organizations, and states that create ideas. So this is protecting people. It gave intangible ideas, knowledge, and expressions that require their use to be approved by their owner. So we're talking about movies, books, music recordings, computer software, pharmaceuticals, and other advanced technologies. And this was done through the use of patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. So, for example, when a pharmaceutical company comes out with a new drug, it is illegal internationally to reproduce that drug. So when you have a new drug, you cannot get a so-called generic. You have to get the brand drug for the first, I think it's like 10 years at least, maybe even longer than that, of the drug's existence. But so there's like a patent on it, but then the patent expires after 10 or so years. I'm not sure what the exact number is. And then once the patent expires on the drug, other companies can make the exact same drug and sell it at a cheaper price as generics. So that's why you have generic drugs and brand name drugs. So the global reality is that this contradicts the flat earth. It's a barrier to production and competition. Also, how this plays out is that pharmaceutical companies have engaged in biopiracy of indigenous medicine, where they've used medical knowledge from more indigenous backdrops and individuals and groups of people and cultures, without the indigenous group benefiting in any monetary way from that knowledge, but the pharmaceutical company benefits vastly with the patent system. So now into the World Trade Organization. This is a multilateral organization headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, with 160 member nations. Each member state has an equal vote. There is a focus on non-tariff related barriers to trade, such as differences between nations on regulations on such things as manufactured goods or food. Its operations are premised on the neoliberal idea that all nations benefit from free and open trade, and it is dedicated to reducing and ultimately eliminating barriers to such trade. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail, there are winners and losers to these neoliberal policies. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, has a goal of macro, that means large-scale economic stability for both member nations and the global economy generally. It deals with exchange rates, balances of payments, international capital flows, and the monitoring of member states and their macroeconomic policies. After the 1970s, developed countries stopped seeking adjustment loans to recover from World War I, and developing countries sought such loans. Structural adjustment refers to the conditions that developing countries must meet to receive these loans, which are based on neoliberal ideas. So that means reduce government spending, which is also known as austerity or austerity measures. So the government, you can't have so-called big government providing a lot of services and protections to domestically to people living in that country, especially the poor. So there would be like no welfare programs or minimal welfare programs. Governance structure is dominated by the US, with 17% of the total IMF vote and veto power over any strategic decision. Votes are a function of a fixed number for each nation, plus additional voting power based on each nation's quota of contributions to the fund. The IMF now has hundreds of billions of dollars. It's massive. The World Bank is a specialized agency of the UN consisting of 188 nations. It moved beyond just physical infrastructure to larger issues of economic development related to population, education, health, social security, environment, culture, and poverty alleviation. Some criticisms of how the World Bank operates is that it, again, is dominated by developed countries, and it's serving certain interests at the expense of many. So this is a really shocking fact, but developing countries often pay more in interest to developed countries that gave them loans than what they originally received in aid from those developed countries. So it's kind of like predatory lending at like an international level. The end of Bretton Woods. So Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard on August 15, 1971. So that ended the Bretton Woods system. The demise of Bretton Woods is due to other nations and currencies rising in importance. So the supremacy of the United States had diminished significantly. International finance was restored to major importance after years of being subordinated to a focus within national economies. So changes in and critiques of Bretton Woods era organizations, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. So there have been recent changes due to globalization, major trade disputes, increasing power and ambition of growing economic powers. Some criticisms of these organizations is the leadership of them, more specifically the role of the U.S., how these organizations often hurt developing countries through these austerity programs that hurt the poor. lack of transparency in decision making and operations. Many argue that the privatization of state-run systems happened too quickly and went hand in hand with corruption, and that they were driven by this ideological belief in free markets and distrust of government, which is a very neoliberal mindset. There is a fear that a new era of protectionism could lead to a slowdown in the global economy. There are predictions today, as of the recording of this PowerPoint lecture, that Trump's trade war with China is coming from a place of protectionism. Like America First, one of his slogans, is like a form of protectionism. And that this protectionism could lead to another major global recession. That is something that has been predicted. Time will tell. The European Union was founded because there was a belief in its formation was that Europe must band together to compete with the US. So it started with the integration of coal and steel throughout Europe, as sort of a pan-European thing. The EU is now the largest domestic market in the developed world. With it came the creation of a monetary union, the European Central Bank, and a common EU currency called the euro. You also have the establishment of a pan-European or all-European Parliament. In reaction to this, more recently, a couple of years ago, in Great Britain, there was a popular vote given to the people where the people could vote whether they thought Britain should stay or leave the European Union. And how it kind of played out is that people on the far right, like neoliberalism, is more globally on like the political spectrum, a more right-leaning ideology. But even further to the right than, if you move further to the right than neoliberalism, you have some forms of protectionism. And this rhetoric often involves like anti-immigrant rhetoric, that the flux of immigrants is going to destroy the culture and the society, often depicting immigrants as bad people. I should just note that statistically, like every time this is measured, immigrants to the United States commit crimes disproportionately less often than the general population. Every time that's measured, that is sort of determined. But anyways, like, and this is happening in Europe and happened in Great Britain, where you have this anti-immigrant rhetoric. So this was stirred up, and people in Great Britain were afraid of immigrants, and there's often like racism tied into this. And because of this, many people voted for Great Britain to leave the European Union, because it was the European Union that was requiring Great Britain to take in large numbers of refugees, particularly from Syria. So many people argue, though, that a lot of people didn't understand what would be the economic fallout of this decision. So the exiting of Great Britain from the European Union is called Brexit. That's like the abbreviation of this phenomenon. And where we're at now is that there has been deadline after deadline where the Parliament needed to approve the exit plan for leaving the European Union, and they keep denying that. plan and setting up a delayed new exit date. So we don't know how this is going to turn out, but many people are predicting that this is going to be really devastating for the economy in Great Britain because it's going to make trade with other European countries much more complex and expensive and difficult, and it's going to hurt a lot of industry. The Eurozone encompasses those nations in Europe, 18 in total, that have adopted the euro as their basic currency. And the euro, by the way, was launched in 2002. Or NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So developments in Europe spurred the US and Canada to sign a bilateral trade agreement in 1988. Negotiations began in 1990 and were completed in 1992 and came into effect in 1994. They made the controversial decision to include Mexico, and this was controversial because Mexico was much less developed. Some criticisms of NAFTA are that wages declined rather than increased in Mexico, that the initial gain in Mexican jobs has given way to a loss of jobs, especially to China. Mexican farmers have been disadvantaged in comparison to American farmers who receive subsidies. Subsidies are when the government pays people amounts of money to help compensate for the cost of whatever they're doing. So American farmers receive money from the government as subsidies to help them, stay in business. U.S. workers also lost jobs because their firms have moved to Mexico or Canada. Wages have declined in the U.S., and there's been worsened environmental degradation and labor issues. So these criticisms come from both the left and the right. A lot of people are pretty disappointed with NAFTA. It's a lot of centrists that seem to defend it, with some exceptions to that pattern, of course. The textbook explains, trying to analyze these criticisms and how much truth they have. And it says that job losses in industrial states are not necessarily linked to NAFTA. This hasn't been completely established that it's directly related to NAFTA. The multinational corporation, or the MNC. So the textbook brought up the controversy or debate on whether the multinational corporation is more powerful than the nation state or on its way to being more powerful than the nation state. So many libertarians, for example, are afraid of the government having too much power. But some people argue that they should be more afraid of corporations, multinational corporations, having too much power and infringing on their freedom. MNCs account for about a tenth of the world's gross national product and a third of the world's exports. The WEF, or the World Economic Forum, established in 1971, meets annually in January in Davos, Switzerland. It was founded as an independent, not-for-profit organization. Critics see elite influence on political and economic matters as inappropriate, and also devoted to increased expansion and profitability of the capitalist system is sort of its goal, and that it doesn't have involvement from non-government organizations or nonprofits, religious organizations, or labor unions. So the World Economic Forum is again seen as this elitist meeting of the minds of mostly neoliberal billionaires that make a lot of decisions that impact the rest of the world economically. So you have people on the left that are very critical of neoliberalism, but on the very far right, you also have the protectionist mindset that's also critical of neoliberalism. So it's kind of interesting because compared to the global political spectrum, the political spectrum in the United States is shifted right now very far to the right, and this might change eventually. But even Democrats like the Clintons and even Barack Obama follow a lot of very neoliberal ideas, and neoliberalism is considered globally farther to the right. It's a more conservative, right-leaning ideology. So a lot of like centrist Democrats in other global contexts would be considered on the right, even though in the United States they're considered sort of center-left. So it's sort of interesting like how our political spectrum is so skewed to the right. So some review questions. I'm not going to answer these questions for you this time because it's after the midterm and I want to make it a little bit more challenging. So you'll have to use the PowerPoint yourself to devise answers to these questions. But explain the Bretton Woods system, describe 3 organizations that came out of that system, when and why did the Bretton Woods system end, explain structural adjustment, and explain 2 criticisms of the IMF and the World Bank. Some discussion questions. Do you think Brexit is a good idea? Do you think MNCs will become more powerful than nation states? And do you think neoliberal economic policies have been more helpful or harmful globally?